When it comes to finances, you want to avoid any surprises. This is where today's topic comes in. We're talking about diluted earnings per share. Diluted earnings per share is basically a method when evaluating a company to make sure you take into consideration every unannounced guest that might show up and that would eventually be entitled to the earnings. It's like throwing a party. You want to make sure there's enough food to go around. So, let's jump right in. Welcome back to my channel where I help analysts and students up their game when it comes to work or their exams. So let's get this started. Let's do a quick intro. Basic earnings per share is basically the earnings divided by the weighted amount of outstanding shares by the end of the year. The problem with this, it's oversimplified and can lead to an overstated earnings per share. This means that a company can look more favorable than it actually is. The reason is we have to take into consideration some convertible securities that have dilutive properties. So these dilutive properties usually lead into a lower earnings per share. Examples are convertible preferred shares or convertible bonds, and there are others. So today we're going to go through an example where we're going to calculate the earnings per share and then from the same company add on two distinctive dilutive securities and see what their impacts are. So grab your pens and paper. We're going to go through a very good example. You are asked to evaluate a large grocery store chain called Kale Trails. And you're provided with the following data. You have the net income, which is 2.5 million, and 200,000 of preferred dividend paid. They also give you information about the shares. Shares outstanding as of the beginning of the year, 1 million. Issued shares in April 2020, 200, and shares repurchased in October, 100,000. So let's look at the basic earnings per share formula. It's net income minus the preferred dividends paid, because that's earnings that you're not eligible to, divided by the weighted average of outstanding shares. So, step 1, let's calculate the weighted average of shares outstanding. It can be tricky, so we'll go at it one step at a time. As you can see, from January to March, there's only 1 million outstanding shares. In April, they issue 200,000 shares. So April to September, there's 1.2 million total shares outstanding. And then in October, they decide to repurchase 100,000 shares. So that's 100,000 less shares that are outstanding for a total of 1.1 million. And that lasts only 3 months. We have to calculate the weight of how long each of these shares outstanding lasted throughout the year. So all you do is the duration divided by 12 months, the total amount of months in a year. So January to March represent 25% of the year, April to September represent 50% of the year, and October to December represent 25% of the year. And finally, you can calculate your weighted average by just doing your weight times shares outstanding and summing the total. This tells us that the average weighted amount of outstanding shares throughout the year was 1,125,000. Now it's time to calculate our eligible earnings. This is pretty easy. You take the net income, 2.5 million. You have to remove the preferred dividends paid because you're calculating the earnings per common share, and preferred dividends are not eligible to common shares. And that leaves you with a final amount of eligible earnings of 2.3 million. And finally, calculate your basic EPS. You have to divide your eligible earnings by your weighted average of outstanding shares. So 2.3 million divided by 1,125,000 shares, and that gives us a basic earnings per share of $2.04 per share. All right, that was pretty easy. Let's add our first dilutive security, convertible preferred shares. So what happens if all eligible shares are converted? Well, first of all, if preferred securities are converted, that means that there would be no preferred dividend to be paid. And number 2, there would be a larger pool of outstanding common shares. So then that impacts our formula because we no longer have any preferred dividends that need to be netted out of the net income. So it becomes net income divided by the weighted average of outstanding shares, including any converted shares. Here we're going to assume that the shares have been converted from the beginning of the year, which is a pretty conservative assumption. So if the preferred shares, the data tells us that each convertible share can turn into 5 common shares, and that there's 50,000 preferred shares. That means that if they're all converted, we would have an additional 250,000 common shares. All right, so then let's go back to step 1 and adjust the data. Now, January to March, instead of a million outstanding shares, we have 1,250,000 outstanding shares for the duration of 3 months. This increases the weighted average to 1,375,000. Step 2, calculating the eligible earnings. As we said earlier, because there's no more preferred shares, no preferred dividend was paid. So there's nothing to minus out from the net income. So the eligible earnings are 2.5 million. Step 3, calculating your diluted earnings per share, 2.5 million divided by 1,375,000, and that gives us $1.82 per share. As you can see, we're already lower than the $2.04 that we had originally. Good job. Now let's add another dilutive security. What happens if all eligible debt is converted? So, first of all, if debt is converted, there is no interest that you had to pay on this debt. So the earnings increase. And impact number 2, there would be an even larger pool of outstanding shares. So here again, the formula needs adjustment. The net income now needs to be adjusted upwards to have the after-tax interest. And that would be divided by the weighted average of outstanding shares, which now includes the converted debt. So, according to their financial report, Kale Trails has $250,000 of bonds at 4% that are convertible to 300,000 common shares. So that's $250,000 at 4% represent $10,000. Taxes at 30%, so after tax, we're actually increasing the net income by $7,000. Okay, now let's go back to our data and adjust it with this new information that we have. So January to March, now that we have convertible securities that are shares and debt, if all of them were to be converted, well, January to March, we now have 1,550,000 outstanding shares. And that weighted average, again increased, has become 1,450,000 common shares outstanding. Let's go back to our eligible earnings. Net income reported, 2.5 million. Preferred dividends paid, none, because all convertible shares have been converted. And finally, we have to add back the after-tax interest of $7,000 we just calculated. So that leaves us with eligible earnings of $2,507,000. Calculating our diluted EPS, we are now at 1.73 cents. As you can see, the more diluted securities that we add, the lower our EPS is. The final EPS is now 15% lower than the original basic EPS that we had calculated. So that's quite considerable. Now that we have the full picture, let's analyze our data. As you can see, the basic EPS started off at $2.04. Adding the convertible preferred shares, we're at 1.82. And finally, the convertible preferred shares and the debt, we're at 1.73. Like I said, this is 15% lower than the original earnings per share. That's quite considerable. This gives you an idea why it's so important to include all convertible securities in your analysis, in particular when you're comparing companies together, and even more particularly when you're planning on investing money. And that was it for today's exercise. I hope that you enjoyed and you have a better understanding of diluted earnings per share. If you did enjoy this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.